Volume 1, Our Oriental Heritage, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued. Cassette 3, Side 2. Most often, however, tattooing itself was considered insufficiently visible or impressive, and a number of tribes on every continent produced deep scars on their flesh to make themselves lovelier to their fellows or more discouraging to their enemies. As Théophile Gautier put it, having no clothes to embroider, they embroidered their skins. Flints or mussel shells cut the flesh, and often a ball of earth was placed within the wound to enlarge the scar. The Torres Straits natives wore huge scars like epaulettes. The Abeokuta cut themselves to produce scars imitative of lizards, alligators, or tortoises. There is, says Georg, no part of the body that has not been perfected, decorated, disfigured, painted, bleached, tattooed, reformed, stretched, or squeezed, out of vanity or desire for ornament. The Botocudos derived their name from a plug, botuk, which they inserted into the lower lip and the ears in the 8th year of life and repeatedly replaced with a larger plug until the opening was as much as 4 inches in diameter. Hottentot women trained the labia minora to assume enormous lengths, so producing at last the Hottentot apron so greatly admired by their men. Earrings and nose rings were de rigueur. The natives of Gippsland believed that one who died without a nose ring would suffer horrible torments in the next life. It is all very barbarous, says the modern lady, as she bores her ears for rings, paints her lips and her cheeks, tweezes her eyebrows, reforms her eyelashes, powders her face, her neck and her arms, and compresses her feet. The tattooed sailor speaks with superior sympathy of the savages he has known, and the continental student, horrified by primitive mutilations, sports his honorific scars. Clothing was apparently in its origins a form of ornament, a sexual deterrent or charm, rather than an article of use against cold or shame. The Cimbri were in the habit of tobogganing naked over the snow. When Darwin, pitying the nakedness of the Fuegians, gave one of them a red cloth as a protection against the cold, the native tore it into strips, which he and his companions then used as ornaments. As Cook had said of them timelessly, they were content to be naked, but ambitious to be fine. In like manner, the ladies of the Orinoco cut into shreds the materials given them by the Jesuit fathers for clothing. They wore the ribbons so made around their necks, but insisted that they would be ashamed to wear clothing. An old author describes the Brazilian natives as usually naked, and adds, "Now already some do wear apparel, but esteem it so little that they wear it rather for fashion than for honesty's sake, and because they are commanded to wear it, as is well seen by some that sometimes come abroad with certain garments no further than the navel, without any other thing, or others only a cap on their heads, and leave the other garments at home." When clothing became something more than an adornment, it served partly to indicate the married status of a loyal wife, partly to accentuate the form and beauty of woman. For the most part, primitive women asked of clothing precisely what later women have asked, not that it should quite cover their nakedness, but that it should enhance or suggest their charms. Everything changes, except woman and man. From the beginning, both sexes preferred ornaments to clothing. Primitive trade seldom deals in necessities. It is usually confined to articles of adornment or play. Jewelry is one of the most ancient elements of civilization. In tombs 20,000 years old, shells and teeth have been found strung into necklaces. From simple beginnings, such embellishments soon reached impressive proportions and played a lofty role in life. The Gala women wore rings to the weight of 6 pounds, and some Dinka women carried half a hundredweight of decoration. One African belle wore copper rings which became hot under the sun, so that she had to employ an attendant to shade or fan her. The queen of the Wabunias, on the Congo, wore a brass collar weighing 20 pounds. She had to lie down every now and then to rest. Poor women who were so unfortunate as to have only light jewelry imitated carefully the steps of those who carried great burdens of bedizenment. The first source of art, then, is akin to the display of colors and plumage on the male animal in mating time. It lies in the desire to adorn and beautify the body. And just as self-love and mate-love, overflowing, pour out their surplus of affection upon nature, so the impulse to beautify passes from the personal to the external world. The soul seeks to express its feeling in objective ways, through color and form. Art really begins when men undertake to beautify things. Perhaps its first external medium was pottery. The potter's wheel, like writing in the state, belongs to the historic civilizations, but even without it primitive men, or rather women, lifted this ancient industry to an art and achieved merely with clay, water, and deft fingers an astonishing symmetry of form. Witness the pottery fashioned by the Baranga of South Africa or by the Pueblo Indians. When the potter applied colored designs to the surface of the vessel he had formed, he was creating the art of painting. In primitive hands, painting is not yet an independent art. It exists as an adjunct to pottery and statuary. Nature men made colors out of clay, and the Andamanese made oil colors by mixing ochre with oils or fats. Such colors were used to ornament weapons, implements, vases, clothing, and buildings. Many hunting tribes of Africa and Oceania painted upon the walls of their caves or upon neighboring rocks vivid representations of the animals that they sought in the chase. Sculpture, like painting, probably owed its origin to pottery. The potter found that he could mold not only articles of use, but imitative figures that might serve as magic amulets and then as things of beauty in themselves. The Eskimos carved caribou antlers and walrus ivory into figurines of animals and men. Again, primitive man sought to mark his hut, or a totem pole, or a grave, with some image that would indicate the object worshipped or the person deceased. At first he carved merely a face upon a post, then a head, then the whole post, and through this filial marking of graves, sculpture became an art. So the ancient dwellers on Easter Island topped with enormous monolithic statues the vaults of their dead. Scores of such statues, many of them 20 feet high, have been found there. Some, now prostrate in ruins, were apparently 60 feet tall. How did architecture begin? We can hardly apply so magnificent a term to the construction of the primitive hut, for architecture is not mere building, but beautiful building. It began when for the first time a man or a woman thought of a dwelling in terms of appearance as well as of use. Probably this effort to give beauty or sublimity to a structure was directed first to graves rather than to homes. While the commemorative pillar developed into statuary, the tomb grew into a temple. For to primitive thought the dead were more important and powerful than the living, and besides, the dead could remain settled in one place, while the living wandered too often to warrant their raising permanent homes. Even in early days, and probably long before he thought of carving objects or building tombs, man found pleasure in rhythm and began to develop the crying and warbling, the prancing and preening of the animal into song and dance. Perhaps, like the animal, he sang before he learned to talk and danced as early as he sang. Indeed, no art so characterized or expressed primitive man as the dance. He developed it from primordial simplicity to a complexity unrivaled in civilization, and varied it into 1,000 forms. The great festivals of the tribes were celebrated chiefly with communal and individual dancing. Great wars were opened with martial steps and chants. The great ceremonies of religion were a mingling of song, drama, and dance. What seems to us now to be forms of play were probably serious matters to early men. They danced not merely to express themselves, but to offer suggestions to nature or the gods. For example, the periodic incitation to abundant reproduction was accomplished chiefly through the hypnotism of the dance. Spencer derived the dance from the ritual of welcoming a victorious chief home from the wars. Freud derived it from the natural expression of sensual desire and the group technique of erotic stimulation. If one should assert, with similar narrowness, that the dance was born of sacred rites and mummeries, and then merge the three theories into one, there might result as definite a conception of the origin of the dance as can be attained by us today. From the dance, we may believe, came instrumental music and the drama. The making of such music appears to arise out of a desire to mark and accentuate with sound the rhythm of the dance, and to intensify with shrill or rhythmic notes the excitement necessary to patriotism or procreation. The instruments were limited in range and accomplishment, but almost endless in variety. Native ingenuity exhausted itself in fashioning horns, trumpets, gongs, tam-tams, clappers, rattles, castanets, flutes, and drums, from horns, skins, shells, ivory, brass, copper, bamboo, and wood. And it ornamented them with elaborate carving and coloring. The taut string of the bow became the origin of 100 instruments, from the primitive lyre to the Stradivarius violin and the modern pianoforte. Professional singers, like professional dancers, arose among the tribes, and vague scales, predominantly minor in tone, were developed. With music, song, and dance combined, the savage created for us the drama and the opera. For the primitive dance was frequently devoted to mimicry. It imitated, most simply, the movements of animals and men, and passed to the mimetic performance of actions and events. So some Australian tribes staged a sexual dance around a pit ornamented with shrubbery to represent the vulva, and after ecstatic and erotic gestures and prancing, cast their spears symbolically into the pit. The northwestern tribes of the same island played a drama of death and resurrection differing only in simplicity from the medieval mystery and modern passion plays. The dancers slowly sank to the ground, hid their heads under the boughs they carried, and simulated death. Then, at a sign from their leader, they rose abruptly in a wild triumphal chant and dance, announcing the resurrection of the soul. In like manner, 1,000 forms of pantomime described events significant to the history of the tribe, or actions important in the individual life. When rhythm disappeared from these performances, the dance passed into the drama, and one of the greatest of art forms was born. In these ways, pre-civilized men created the forms and bases of civilization. Looking backward upon this brief survey of primitive culture, we find every element of civilization except writing and the state. All the modes of economic life are invented for us here: hunting and fishing, herding and tillage, transport and building, industry and commerce, and finance. All the simpler structures of political life are organized: the clan, the family, the village community, and the tribe. Freedom and order, those hostile foci around which civilization revolves, find their first adjustment and reconciliation. Law and justice begin. The fundamentals of morals are established: the training of children, the regulation of the sexes, the inculcation of honor and decency, of manners and loyalty. The bases of religion are laid, and its hopes and terrors are applied to the encouragement of morals and the strengthening of the group. Speech is developed into complex languages, medicine and surgery appear, and modest beginnings are made in science, literature, and art. All in all, it is a picture of astonishing creation, of form rising out of chaos, of one road after another being opened from the animal to the sage. Without these savages and their 100,000 years of experiment and groping, civilization could not have been. We owe almost everything to them, as a fortunate and possibly degenerate youth inherits the means to culture, security, and ease through the long toil of an unlettered ancestry. Chapter 6. The Prehistoric Beginnings of Civilization. 1. Paleolithic Culture. The purpose of prehistory, the romances of archaeology. But we have spoken loosely. These primitive cultures that we have sketched as a means of studying the elements of civilization were not necessarily the ancestors of our own. For all that we know, they may be the degenerate remnants of higher cultures that decayed when human leadership moved in the wake of the receding ice from the tropics to the north temperate zone. We have tried to understand how civilization in general arises and takes form. We have still to trace the prehistoric origins of our own particular civilization. This word prehistoric will be used as applying to all ages before historical records. We wish now to inquire briefly, for this is a field that only borders upon our purpose, by what steps man, before history, prepared for the civilizations of history. How the man of the jungle or the cave became an Egyptian architect, a Babylonian astronomer, a Hebrew prophet, a Persian governor, a Greek poet, a Roman engineer, a Hindu saint, a Japanese artist, and a Chinese sage. We must pass from anthropology through archaeology to history. All over the earth, seekers are digging into the earth. Some for gold, some for silver, some for iron, some for coal, many of them for knowledge. What strange busyness of men exhuming Paleolithic tools from the banks of the Somme, studying with strained necks the vivid paintings on the ceilings of prehistoric caves, unearthing antique skulls at Choukoutien, revealing the buried cities of Mohenjo-Daro or Yucatan, carrying debris in basket caravans out of curse-ridden Egyptian tombs, lifting out of the dust the palaces of Minos and Priam, uncovering the ruins of Persepolis, burrowing into the soil of Africa for some remnant of Carthage, recapturing from the jungle the majestic temples of Angkor. In 1839, Jacques Boucher de Perthes found the first Stone Age flints at Abbeville in France. For 9 years the world laughed at him as a dupe. In 1872, Schliemann, with his own money, almost with his own hands, unearthed the youngest of the many cities of Troy, but all the world smiled incredulously. Never has any century been so interested in history as that which followed the voyage of young Champollion with young Napoleon to Egypt, 1796. Napoleon returned empty-handed, but Champollion came back with all Egypt, past and current, in his grasp. Every generation since has discovered new civilizations or cultures and has pushed farther and farther back the frontier of man's knowledge of his development. There are not many things finer in our murderous species than this noble curiosity, this restless and reckless passion to understand. 1. Men of the Old Stone Age. The geological background, Paleolithic types. Immense volumes have been written to expound our knowledge and conceal our ignorance of primitive man. We leave to other imaginative sciences the task of describing the men of the Old and the New Stone Age. Our concern is to trace the contributions of these Paleolithic and Neolithic cultures to our contemporary life. The picture we must form as background to the story is of an Earth considerably different from that which tolerates us transiently today. An Earth presumably shivering with the intermittent glaciations that made our now temperate zones Arctic for thousands of years, and piled up masses of rock like the Himalayas, the Alps, and the Pyrenees before the plow of the advancing ice. If we accept the precarious theories of contemporary science, the creature who became man by learning to speak was one of the adaptable species that survived from those frozen centuries. In the interglacial stages, while the ice was retreating, and for all we know long before that, this strange organism discovered fire, developed the art of fashioning stone and bone into weapons and tools, and thereby paved the way to civilization. Various remains have been found which, subject to later correction, are attributed to this prehistoric man. In 1929, a young Chinese paleontologist, W.C. Pei, discovered in a cave at Zhou-Ko-Tien, some 37 miles from Peiping, a skull adjudged to be human by such experts as the Abbé Brie and G. Elliot Smith. Near the skull were traces of fire, and stones obviously worked into tools. But mingled with these signs of human agency were the bones of animals ascribed by common consent to the early Pleistocene epoch, 1,000,000 years ago. This Peking skull is by common opinion the oldest human fossil known to us, and the tools found with it are the first human artifacts in history. At Piltdown in Sussex, England, Dawson and Woodward found in 1911 some possibly human fragments now known as Piltdown Man, or Eoanthropus, Dawn Man. The dates assigned to it range spaciously from 1,000,000 to 125,000 B.C. Similar uncertainties attached to the skull and thigh bones found in Java in 1891 and the jawbone found near Heidelberg in 1907. The earliest unmistakably human fossils were discovered at Neanderthal, near Düsseldorf, Germany, in 1857. They date apparently from 40,000 B.C., and so resemble human remains unearthed in Belgium, France, and Spain, and even on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, that a whole race of Neanderthal men has been pictured as possessing Europe some 40 millenniums before our era. They were short, but they had a cranial capacity of 1,600 cubic centimeters, which is 200 more than ours. These ancient inhabitants of Europe seem to have been displaced, some 20,000 B.C., by a new race named Cro-Magnon from the discovery of its relics, 1868, in a grotto of that name in the Dordogne region of southern France. Abundant remains of like type and age have been exhumed at various points in France, Switzerland, Germany, and Wales. They indicate a people of magnificent vigor and stature, ranging from 5 feet 10 inches to 6 feet 4 inches in height, and having a skull capacity of 1,590 to 1,715 cubic centimeters. Like the Neanderthals, Cro-Magnon men are known to us as cavemen because their remains are found in caves, but there is no proof that these were their sole dwelling place. It may be again but a jest of time that only those of them who lived in caves or died in them have transmitted their bones to archaeologists. According to present theory, this splendid race came from Central Asia through Africa into Europe by land bridges presumed to have then connected Africa with Italy and Spain. The distribution of their fossils suggests that they fought for many decades, perhaps centuries, a war with the Neanderthals for the possession of Europe. So old is the conflict between Germany and France. At all events, Neanderthal man disappeared. Cro-Magnon man survived, became the chief progenitor of the modern Western European, and laid the bases of that civilization which we inherit today. The cultural remains of these and other European types of the Old Stone Age have been classified into 7 main groups, according to the location of the earliest or principal finds in France. All are characterized by the use of unpolished stone implements. The first 3 took form in the precarious interval between the 3rd and 4th glaciations. 1. The pre-Shellian culture, or industry, dating some 125,000 B.C. Most of the flints found in this low layer give little evidence of fashioning, and appear to have been used, if at all, as nature provided them. But the presence of many stones of a shape to fit the fist, and in some degree flaked and pointed, gives to pre-Shelleyan man the presumptive honor of having made the first known tool of European man, the coup de poing, or blow of the fist stone. 2. The Shelleyan culture, circa 100,000 B.C., improved this tool by roughly flaking it on both sides, pointing it into the shape of an almond and fitting it better to the hand. 3. The Acheulean culture, about 75,000 B.C., left an abundance of remains in Europe, Greenland, the United States, Canada, Mexico, Africa, the Near East, India, and China. It not only brought the coup de poing to greater symmetry and point, but it produced a vast variety of special tools: hammers, anvils, scrapers, planes, arrowheads, spearheads, and knives. Already one sees a picture of busy human industry. 4. The Mousterian culture is found on all continents, in a special association with the remains of Neanderthal man, about 40,000 B.C. Among these flints, the coup de poing is comparatively rare, as something already ancient and superseded. The implements were formed from a large single flake, lighter, sharper, and shapelier than before, and by skillful hands with a long-established tradition of artisanship. Higher in the Pleistocene strata of southern France appear the remains of 5. The Aurignacian culture, circa 25,000 B.C., the first of the post-glacial industries and the first known culture of Cro-Magnon man. Bone tools, pins, anvils, polishers, etc., were now added to those of stone, and art appeared in the form of crude engravings on the rocks or simple figurines in high relief, mostly of nude women. At a higher stage of Cro-Magnon development, 6. The Solutrean culture appears, circa 20,000 B.C., in France, Spain, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. Points, planes, drills, saws, javelins, and spears were added to the tools and weapons of Aurignacian days. Slim, sharp needles were made of bone. Many implements were carved out of reindeer horn, and the reindeer's antlers were engraved occasionally with animal figures appreciably superior to Aurignacian art. Finally, at the peak of Cro-Magnon growth, 7. The Magdalenian culture appears throughout Europe about 16,000 B.C. In industry, it was characterized by a large assortment of delicate utensils in ivory, bone, and horn, culminating in humble but perfect needles and pins. In art, it was the age of the Altamira drawings, the most perfect and subtle accomplishment of Cro-Magnon man. Through these cultures of the Old Stone Age, prehistoric man laid the bases of those handicrafts which were to remain part of the European heritage until the Industrial Revolution. Their transmission to the classic and modern civilizations was made easier by the widespread of Paleolithic industries. The skull and cave painting found in Rhodesia in 1921, the flints discovered in Egypt by De Morgan in 1896, the Paleolithic finds of Seton Kar in Somaliland, the Old Stone Age deposits in the basin of the Fayum, and the Still Bay culture of South Africa indicate that the Dark Continent went through approximately the same prehistoric periods of development in the art of flaking stone as those which we have outlined in Europe. Perhaps, indeed, the quasi-Aurignacian remains in Tunis and Algiers strengthen the hypothesis of an African origin or stopping point for the Cro-Magnon race, and therefore for European man. Paleolithic implements have been dug up in Syria, India, China, Siberia, and other sections of Asia. Andrews and his Jesuit predecessors came upon them in Mongolia. Neanderthal skeletons and Mousterian Aurignacian flints have been exhumed in great abundance in Palestine. And we have seen how the oldest known human remains and implements have lately been unearthed near Pepin. Bone tools have been discovered in Nebraska, which some patriotic authorities would place at 500,000 B.C. Arrowheads have been found in Oklahoma and New Mexico, which their finders assure us were made in 350,000 B.C. So vast was the bridge by which prehistoric transmitted the foundations of civilization to historic man. 2. Arts of the Old Stone Age: tools, fire, painting, sculpture. If now we sum up the implements fashioned by Paleolithic man, we shall gain a clearer idea of his life than by giving loose rein to our fancy. It was natural that a stone in the fist should be the first tool. Many an animal could have taught that to man. So the coup de poing, a rock sharp at one end, round at the other, to fit the palm of the hand, became for primeval man hammer, axe, chisel, scraper, knife, and saw. Even to this day the word hammer means, etymologically, a stone. Gradually these specific tools were differentiated out of one homogeneous form. Holes were bored to attach a handle, teeth were inserted to make a saw, branches were tipped with the coup de poing to make a pick, an arrow, or a spear. The scraper stone that had the shape of a shell became a shovel or a hoe. The rough-surfaced stone became a file. The stone in a sling became a weapon of war that would survive even classical antiquity. Given bone, wood, and ivory as well as stone, and Paleolithic man made himself a varied assortment of weapons and tools. Polishers, mortars, axes, planes, scrapers, drills, lamps, knives, chisels, choppers, lances, anvils, etchers, daggers, fishhooks, harpoons, wedges, awls, pins, and doubtless many more. Every day he stumbled upon new knowledge, and sometimes he had the wit to develop his chance discoveries into purposeful inventions. But his great achievement was fire. Darwin has pointed out how the hot lava of volcanoes might have taught men the art of fire. According to Aeschylus, Prometheus established it by igniting a narthex stalk in the burning crater of a volcano on the Isle of Lemnos. Among Neanderthal remains we find bits of charcoal and charred bones. Man-made fire, then, is at least 40,000 years old. Cro-Magnon man ground stone bowls to hold the grease that he burned to give him light. The lamp, therefore, is also of considerable age. Presumably it was fire that enabled man to meet the threat of cold from the advancing ice. Fire that left him free to sleep on the earth at night, since animals dreaded the marble as much as primitive men worshipped it. Fire that conquered the dark and began that lessening of fear which is one of the golden threads in the not-quite golden web of history. Fire that created the old and honorable art of cooking, extending the diet of man to 1,000 foods inedible before. Fire that led at last to the fusing of metals, and the only real advance in technology from Cro-Magnon days to the Industrial Revolution. Strange to relate, and as if to illustrate Gautier's lines on robust art outlasting emperors and states, our clearest relics of Paleolithic man are fragments of his art. 60 years ago, Signor Marcelino de Sautuola came upon a large cave on his estate at Altamira, in northern Spain. For thousands of years, the entrance had been hermetically sealed by fallen rocks naturally cemented with stalagmite deposits. Blasts for new construction accidentally opened the entrance. 3 years later, Sautuola explored the cave and noticed some curious markings on the walls. One day his little daughter accompanied him. Not compelled like her father to stoop as she walked through the cave, she could look up and observe the ceiling. There she saw, in vague outline, the painting of a great bison, magnificently colored and drawn. Many other drawings were found on closer examination of the ceiling and the walls. When in 1880 Sautuola published his report on these observations, archaeologists greeted him with genial skepticism. Some did him the honor of going to inspect the drawings, only to pronounce them the forgery of a hoaxer. For 30 years this quite reasonable incredulity persisted. Then the discovery of other drawings in caves generally conceded to be prehistoric, from their contents of unpolished flint tools and polished ivory and bone, confirmed Sautuola's judgment. But Sautuola now was dead. Geologists came to Altamira and testified with the unanimity of hindsight that the stalagmite coating on many of the drawings was a Paleolithic deposit. General opinion now places these Altamira drawings, and the greater portion of extant prehistoric art, in the Magdalenian culture, some 16,000 B.C. Paintings slightly later in time, but still of the Old Stone Age, have been found in many caves of France. Most often the subjects of these drawings are animals, reindeers, mammoths, horses, boars, bears, etc. These presumably were dietetic luxuries and therefore favored objects of the chase. Sometimes the animals are transfixed with arrows. These, in the view of Fraser and Reinach, were intended as magic images that would bring the animal under the power and into the stomach of the artist or the hunter. Conceivably, they were just plain art, drawn with the pure joy of aesthetic creation. The crudest representations should have sufficed the purposes of magic, whereas these paintings are often of such delicacy, power, and skill as to suggest the unhappy thought that art, in this field at least, has not advanced much in the long course of human history. Here is life, action, nobility, conveyed overwhelmingly with one brave line or two. Here a single stroke, or is it that others have faded, creates a living, charging beast. Will Leonardo's Last Supper or El Greco's Assumption bear up as well as these Cro-Magnon paintings after 20,000 years? Painting is a sophisticated art, presuming many centuries of mental and technical development. If we may accept current theory, which it is always a perilous thing to do, painting developed from statuary by a passage from carving in the round to bas-relief and thence to mere outline and coloring. Painting is sculpture minus a dimension. The intermediate prehistoric art is well represented by an astonishingly vivid bas-relief of an archer, or a spearman, on the Aurignacian cliffs at Locelle in France. In a cave in Ariège, France, Louis Béguin discovered, among other Magdalenian relics, several ornamental handles carved out of reindeer antlers. One of these is of mature and excellent workmanship, as if the art had already generations of tradition and development behind it. Throughout the prehistoric Mediterranean, Egypt, Crete, Italy, France, and Spain, countless figures of fat little women are found, which indicate either a worship of motherhood or an African conception of beauty. Stone statues of a wild horse, a reindeer, and a mammoth have been unearthed in Czechoslovakia, among remains uncertainly ascribed to 30,000 B.C. The whole interpretation of history as progress falters when we consider that these statues, bas-reliefs, and paintings, numerous though they are, may be but an infinitesimal fraction of the art that expressed or adorned the life of primeval man. What remains is found in caves, where the elements were in some measure kept at bay. It does not follow that prehistoric men were artists only when they were in caves. They may have carved as sedulously and ubiquitously as the Japanese, and may have fashioned statuary as abundantly as the Greeks. They may have painted not only the rocks in their caverns, but textiles, wood, everything, not excepting themselves. They may have created masterpieces far superior to the fragments that survive. In one grotto a tube was discovered, made from the bones of a reindeer, and filled with pigment. In another a stone pallet was picked up, still thick with red ochre paint, despite the transit of 200 centuries. Apparently the arts were highly developed and widely practiced 18,000 years ago. Perhaps there was a class of professional artists among Paleolithic men. Perhaps there were bohemians, starving in the less respectable caves, denouncing the commercial bourgeoisie, plotting the death of academies, and forging antiques. 2. Neolithic culture. The kitchen middens, the lake dwellers, the coming of agriculture, the taming of animals, technology, Neolithic weaving, pottery, building, transport, religion, science. Summary of the prehistoric preparation for civilization. At various times in the last 100 years, great heaps of seemingly prehistoric refuse have been found in France, Sardinia, Portugal, Brazil, Japan, and Manchuria, but above all in Denmark, where they received that queer name of kitchen middens, Kjøkkenmøddinger, by which such ancient messes are now generally known. These rubbish heaps are composed of shells, especially of oysters, mussels, and periwinkles, of the bones of various land and marine animals, of tools and weapons of horn, bone, and unpolished stone, and of mineral remains like charcoal, ashes, and broken pottery. These unprepossessing relics are apparently signs of a culture formed about the 8th millennium before Christ, later than the true Paleolithic, and yet not properly Neolithic, because not yet arrived at the use of polished stone. We know hardly anything of the men who left these remains, except that they had a certain Catholic taste. Along with the slightly older culture of the Mas d'Azil in France, the middens represent a Mesolithic, middle stone, or transition period between the Paleolithic and the Neolithic age. In the year 1854, the winter being unusually dry, the level of the Swiss lakes sank and revealed another epoch in prehistory. At some 200 localities in these lakes, piles were found which had stood in place under the water for from 30 to 70 centuries. The piles were so arranged as to indicate that small villages had been built upon them, perhaps for isolation or defense. Each was connected with the land only by a narrow bridge, whose foundations in some cases were still in place. Here and there even the framework of the houses had survived the patient play of the waters. Amid these ruins were the tools of bone and polished stone, which became for archaeologists the distinguishing mark of the new Stone Age that flourished some 10,000 B.C. in Asia and some 5,000 B.C. in Europe. Akin to these remains are the gigantic tumuli left in the valleys of the Mississippi and its tributaries by the strange race that we call the mound builders, of which we know nothing except that in these mounds, shaped in the form of altars, geometric figures, or totem animals, are found objects of stone, shell, bone, and beaten metal which place these mysterious men at the end of the Neolithic period. If from such remains we attempt to patch together some picture of the new Stone Age, we find at once a startling innovation: agriculture. In one sense, all human history hinges upon two revolutions: the Neolithic passage from hunting to agriculture, and the modern passage from agriculture to industry. No other revolutions have been quite as real or basic as these. The remains show that the lake dwellers ate wheat, millet, rye, barley, and oats, besides 120 kinds of fruit and many varieties of nut. No plows have been found in these ruins, probably because the first plowshares were of wood, some strong tree trunk and branch fitted with a flint edge. But a Neolithic rock carving unmistakably shows a peasant guiding a plow drawn by 2 oxen. This marks the appearance of one of the epical inventions of history. Before agriculture, the earth could have supported, in the rash estimate of Sir Arthur Keith, only some 20 million men, and the lives of these were shortened by the mortality of the chase and war. Now began that multiplication of mankind which definitely confirmed man's mastery of the planet. Meanwhile, the men of the New Stone Age were establishing another of the foundations of civilization, the domestication and breeding of animals. Doubtless this was a long process, probably antedating the Neolithic period. A certain natural sociability may have contributed to the association of man and animal, as we may still see in the delight that primitive people take in taming wild beasts and in filling their huts with monkeys, parrots, and similar companions. The oldest bones in the Neolithic remains, circa 8000 B.C., are those of the dog, the most ancient and honorable companion of the human race. A little later, circa 6000 B.C., came the goat, the sheep, the pig, and the ox. Finally, the horse, which to Paleolithic man had been, if we may judge from the cave drawings, merely a beast of prey, was taken into camp, tamed, and turned into a beloved slave. In 100 ways he was now put to work to increase the leisure, the wealth, and the power of man. The new lord of the earth began to replenish his food supply by breeding as well as hunting, and perhaps he learned, in the same Neolithic age, to use cow's milk as food. Neolithic inventors slowly improved and extended the tool chest and armory of man. Here among the remains are pulleys, levers, grindstones, awls, pincers, axes, hoes, ladders, chisels, spindles, looms, sickles, saws, fishhooks, skates, needles, brooches, and pins. Here, above all, is the wheel, another fundamental invention of mankind, one of the modest essentials of industry and civilization. Already in this new Stone Age it was developed into disc and spoked varieties. Stones of every sort, even obdurate diorite and obsidian, were ground, bored, and finished into a polished form. Flints were mined on a large scale. In the ruins of a Neolithic mine at Brandon, England, 8 worn picks of deer horn were found, on whose dusty surfaces were the fingerprints of the workmen who had laid down those tools 10,000 years ago. In Belgium, the skeleton of such a new Stone Age miner, who had been crushed by falling rock, was discovered with his deer horn pick still clasped in his hands. Across 100 centuries we feel him as one of us, and share in weak imagination his terror and agony. Through how many bitter millenniums men have been tearing out of the bowels of the earth the mineral bases of civilization. Having made needles and pins, man began to weave, or beginning to weave, he was moved to make needles and pins. No longer content to clothe himself with the furs and hides of beast, he wove the wool of his sheep and the fibers found in the plants into garments from which came the robe of the Hindu, the toga of the Greek, the skirt of the Egyptian, and all the fascinating gamut of human dress. Dyes were mixed from the juices of plants or the minerals of the earth, and garments were stained with colors into luxuries for kings. At first men seem to have plaited textiles as they plaited straw by interlacing one fiber with another. Then they pierced holes into animal skins and bound the skins with coarse fibers passing through the holes, as with the corsets of yesterday and the shoes of today. Gradually the fibers were refined into thread, and sewing became one of the major arts of womankind. The stone distaffs and spindles among the Neolithic ruins reveal one of the great origins of human industry. Even mirrors are found in these remains. Everything was ready for civilization. No pottery has been discovered in the earlier Paleolithic graves. Fragments of it appear in the remains of the Magdalenian culture in Belgium, but it is only in the Mesolithic age of the kitchen middens that we find any developed use of earthenware. The origin of the art, of course, is unknown. Perhaps some observant primitive noticed that the trough made by his foot in clay held water with little seepage. Perhaps some accidental baking of a piece of wet clay by an adjoining fire gave him the hint that fertilized invention, and revealed to him the possibilities of a material so abounding in quantity, so pliable to the hand, and so easy to harden with fire or the sun. Doubtless he had for thousands of years carried his food and drink in such natural containers as gourds and coconuts, and the shells of the sea. Then he had made himself cups and ladles of wood or stone, and baskets and hampers of rushes or straw. Now he made lasting vessels of baked clay, and created another of the major industries of mankind. So far as the remains indicate, Neolithic man did not know the potter's wheel, but with his own hands he fashioned clay into forms of beauty as well as use, decorated it with simple designs, and made pottery, almost at the outset, not only an industry, but an art. Here, too, we find the first evidences of another major industry, building. Paleolithic man left no known trace of any other home than the cave. But in the Neolithic remains we find such building devices as the ladder, the pulley, the lever, and the hinge. The lake-dwellers were skillful carpenters, fastening beam to pile with sturdy wooden pins, or mortising them head to head, or strengthening them with cross-beams notched into their sides. The floors were of clay, the walls of wattlework coated with clay, the roofs of bark, straw, rushes, or weeds. With the aid of the pulley and the wheel, building materials were carried from place to place, and great stone foundations were laid for villages. Transport, too, became an industry. Canoes were built, and must have made the lakes live with traffic. Trade was carried on over mountains and between distant continents. Amber, diorite, jadeite, and obsidian were imported into Europe from afar. Similar words, letters, myths, pottery, and designs betray the cultural contacts of diverse groups of prehistoric men. Outside of pottery, the New Stone Age has left us no art, nothing to compare with the painting and statuary of Paleolithic man. Here and there, among the scenes of Neolithic life from England to China, we find circular heaps of stone called dolmens, upright monoliths called menhirs, and gigantic cromlechs, stone structures of unknown purpose, like those at Stonehenge or in Morbihan. Probably we shall never know the meaning or function of these megaliths. Presumably they are the remains of altars and temples. For Neolithic man doubtless had religions, myths with which to dramatize the daily tragedy and victory of the sun, the death and resurrection of the soil, and the strange earthly influences of the moon. We cannot understand the historic faiths unless we postulate such prehistoric origins. Perhaps the arrangement of the stones was determined by astronomic considerations and suggests, as Schneider thinks, an acquaintance with the calendar. Some scientific knowledge was present, for certain Neolithic skulls give evidence of trephining, and a few skeletons reveal limbs apparently broken and reset. We cannot properly estimate the achievements of prehistoric men, for we must guard against describing their life with imagination that transcends the evidence, while on the other hand we suspect that time has destroyed remains that would have narrowed the gap between primeval and modern man. Even so, the surviving record of Stone Age advances is impressive enough. Paleolithic tools, fire and art, Neolithic agriculture, animal breeding, weaving, pottery, building, transport, and medicine, and the definite domination and wider peopling of the earth by the human race. All the bases had been laid. Everything had been prepared for the historic civilizations except, perhaps, metals, writing, and the state. Let men find a way to record their thoughts and achievements, and thereby transmit them more securely across the generations, and civilization would begin. 3. The transition to history. 1. The coming of metals: copper, bronze, iron. When did the use of metals come to man, and how? Again, we do not know. We merely surmise that it came by accident, and we presume, from the absence of earlier remains, that it began towards the end of the Neolithic Age. Dating this end about 4000 BC, we have a perspective in which the age of metals and of writing and civilization is a mere 6,000 years appended to an age of stone lasting at least 40,000 years, and an age of man lasting 1,000,000 years. So young is the subject of our history. The oldest known metal to be adapted to human use was copper. This book is continued on Cassette 4, Side 1.